Before we get into today's show, I met with my bosses early in the week, and they said if you want to go live for day 2 of the NFL draft, let's get 300 likes on today's show. So help me accomplish that goal so I can go live for day 2 of the draft. Coming up on today's show, we're going to react to a Bleacher Report article that linked the Browns to a former All-Pro linebacker, Shaq Leonard. And then we go down quite a rabbit hole, if you will. I'm talking Alice in Wonderland type of rabbit hole for the NFL draft. So stick around for that. But let's start with Shaq Leonard because Bleacher Report put out an article for all 32 teams, one player each team should sign. And for the Browns, they selected the former 3-time All-Pro and Pro Bowl linebacker, Shaq Leonard. Now, if you don't remember, last year, he was released by the Colts mid-season. He signed a major contract extension with the team. Unfortunately, he suffered some very serious, back and neck injuries, and unfortunately, he was never the same after that. And so, after getting released, he signed with the Philadelphia Eagles, where he didn't do a whole lot. But you got to admit, this is a very Andrew Berry-esque type of signing, where everyone looks away from a player, whether it's because of age, injury history, whatever it may be. But Andrew Berry looks at talent, and he sees a guy that maybe is worth bringing in on training camp and seeing if he can still play at a high level. So I would not be blown away if Andrew Berry pursues Shaq Leonard. Now, the last 4 seasons, they haven't been very kind to Leonard, specifically the last 2. He was so dominant with the Colts coming out of South Carolina State. He was an All-Pro as a rookie linebacker, and no one had heard of him really going into the NFL draft. But when you look at Shaq Leonard's stats from the start of his career to the last 2 seasons, he has missed a ton of time, but the playmaking abilities have completely vanished from his game. He had 17 forced fumbles, 11 interceptions, and 15 sacks the first 3 seasons with the Colts. The last 2 years split between Indy and half a season in Philadelphia. He has been, not even 50% of what he was doing in the first 3 years of his NFL career. But I would be on board with this signing because of what we saw the first few seasons in Indianapolis. We're not talking a big contract. We're talking close to vet minimum. We're not even guaranteeing a roster spot. But man, if you could somehow recapture the start of Shaq Leonard's career, put him with Jim Schwartz, have some familiarity with Bubba Ventrone, his old special teams coordinator, I feel like if there's a team that could try and get some football juice out of the, glory days of Shaq Leonard, it would be the Cleveland Browns, especially when you factor in the Browns linebacker room is not set in stone by any means. I think Devin Bush is competing with potential rookie coming inbound, along with Diabate and Tony Fields for that other starting linebacker spot next to JOK and Jordan Hicks. So why not add a little bit more competition to that room with Shaq Leonard? I don't really see a downside to this signing. If it doesn't work out in training camp and he's not looking like the guy that you were hoping he would, revert back to, you move on from him and maybe you're out $300,000 in guaranteed money via signing bonus, but I'm not going to lose sleep over Jimmy Haslam losing $300K. So would you sign Shaq Leonard? Yes or no? Chime in for me down in the comment section. Now, the Browns have made 2 linebacker signings this offseason. They brought in Jordan Hicks, a guy who has put up over 100 tackles in 5 straight seasons, I believe. He's not the big playmaking linebacker that Shaq Leonard once was, right? He is a very adequate run-stopping middle linebacker that isn't going to change the game with a huge interception or forced fumble, but he's not going to cost you the game because he couldn't wrap up on a running back on 3rd and 4. Meanwhile, Devin Bush is a player that the Browns hope can, be like a Shaq Leonard, a guy that can make big plays, come up with the takeaways, right? Come up with the big pass rushing sacks. That's what he did at Michigan. That's why he was picked 10th overall by the Pittsburgh Steelers. But that phase, that element of his game has just completely vanished the last 2 seasons. And so now, similar to the argument I made for Andrew Berry pursuing Shaq Leonard, Andrew Berry signed Devin Bush, a player who's got that experience and that talent belief, or the belief that talent is somewhere deep inside of him. and he's going to put it on Jim Schwartz to drag it out of Bush. So would Andrew Berry make a similar gamble on Jim Schwartz getting the best out of Shaq Leonard? Would not surprise me or blow me away if that's the case. I also should have mentioned at the start of the show, feeling a little under the weather, so I'm sorry if I sound a little bit nasally. Now with that, let me transition to tell you guys about our awesome sponsor for 60 seconds, Game Time, before we get back to our regularly scheduled programming, because today's show is sponsored by Game Time. Spring is here, which means we've got baseball to watch, Guardians pushing back opening day, first pitch because of the solar eclipse. Who could have seen that coming? Only the MLB. But with Game Time, you can get killer last-minute deals and all-in prices for all the big events. There's nothing more frustrating, in my opinion, than spending like 30 minutes searching for the best ticket prices, and then you get to the checkout portion, and you realize taxes and fees have doubled the prices. But with Game Time, you can actually see the all-in price right from the get-go, which is why you should download the Game Time app and use code CHATSPORTS for $20 off your first purchase. It's the best place to find last-minute seats. So download the Game Time app today, create an account, and use code CHATSPORTS for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply, but again, create an account and redeem that code CHAT Sports for $20 off. I put all that information in the comments and description of today's video. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. To wrap up my thoughts on Shaq Leonard to the Browns potentially, I think this could be a post-draft move, right? Where once teams come out of the NFL draft, they have a much better understanding of what needs they still have that they did not satisfy in the draft because the player they were hoping would be there was picked before them. So they then revert to remaining free agents to plug the last few holes on their roster. If you don't believe me, I mean, go back a year ago, right? The Browns traded for Zadarius Smith on May 12th, 2 weeks after the NFL draft wrapped up. So we always see a flurry of moves after the draft when teams go, okay, we were planning on drafting this guy. We didn't get to get him. So now we're going to turn to free agency and sign this veteran at that same position. So let's say the Browns have a plan of drafting a linebacker, okay? We've spent a lot of time talking about this position group on the show. I think it's a very important need for the Browns. I'm not sold on this linebacker room. I don't think it's a bad idea to put some youth in that linebacker room since they have not drafted a guy at that position since JOK and Tony Fields in 2021. But then I was starting to think about what do the Browns want to see happen in the draft, right? What would be a beneficial shakeout for the Browns in the draft if they want to get Edgerrin Cooper and they hope he falls to them at pick 54, or at least I hope he falls to them. And I was thinking about, well, this actually may work in Cleveland's favor. And let me explain why, because this year's draft, even if you ask an average passive NFL fan, what do you know about the 2024 NFL draft? They're probably going to bring up two positions. Quarterbacks, right? There's tons of good quarterbacks. I heard Caleb Williams, Drake May, Jaden Daniels, J.J. McCarthy, Bo Nix, Michael Penix. And then they'll bring up wide receivers. And this is the part where it actually works out for Andrew Berry and the Browns. Because initially in the offseason, we thought wide receiver would be a shoo-in for the Browns to address early in the draft. But then they traded for Jerry Jeudy, and then they extended Jeudy, showing a lot of long-term faith. And then Andrew Berry at the NFL owners meeting talked about wanting to extend Amari Cooper. So I've got a belief that they're probably not targeting wide receiver early in the draft like they may have thought back in January and February. So now that the wide receiver room is kind of good for Cleveland, well, you may see other teams start to make a run at wide receivers, right? You can look at Mel Kiper's wide receiver rankings, and if everything goes to plan for the Browns, who I don't think are going to be going wide receiver at pick 54 unless a ridiculous name has no business being available at that spot, a run on wide receiver may be Cleveland's hope because then the other positions are not going to be picked, and the Browns are going to have a much better pick of the litter than they originally hoped, right? The goal for Andrew Berry is if they're not going wide receiver, they want the 10 teams in front of them to all pick wide receiver so then they can have the best linebacker or defensive tackle on the board because they weren't picked ahead of the Browns. So who could be a player or two that falls to Cleveland at pick 54 at a slight position of need? I've got 5 fall candidates. We'll break each one down one by one. Jordan Morgan, offensive tackle out of Arizona. Drazan Johnny Newton, defensive tackle from Illinois. Braden Fisk out of Florida State, also on the defensive line. My guy Edgerrin Cooper out of Texas A&M. And then Alabama defensive back KoolAid McKinney. Now, if you're sitting at home thinking, PD, you're full of it, there is no chance these 5 guys are there at pick 54. I've seen way too many mock drafts that all have them going round 1 or early round 2. I did some digging, and I looked at last year's rounds 1 through 7 mock drafts, at least the first 2 rounds, right? And what I found was, take Matt Miller from ESPN. He had 11 players going in the first 53 picks of his mock draft that were actually available at pick 54. Do you follow? Mel Kiper had 10 guys going in the first 53 picks of his mock draft that were available at pick 54 in the actual NFL draft. So it just goes to show, just because Todd McShay, actually I don't know what Todd McShay is doing right now, but just because Dane Brugler and Mel Kiper and all these other NFL draft gurus have these players going before the Browns pick at 54, doesn't mean they'll actually go in that order in the NFL draft. And I know we already somewhat know that, but you might not have realized it was to this degree, where 10 players for Chad Reuter were picked in the first 53 selections of his mock draft, but when the actual draft rolled around, 10 of them were available at pick 54. I hope I did a good job of explaining that, but the point I'm trying to make here is, don't look at mock drafts and think, we can't get that guy. I saw him going pick 35 in Mel Kiper's latest mock. No chance he's available at 54. 9 to 11 players fell in that same boat last year in the mock drafts, and then they were available at pick 54. Mock drafts are extremely difficult to do. It's an unpredictable business of predicting things. So just because a mock drafter has a guy taken at the end of round 1, early round 2, don't put that in stone of, cross him off our wish list. He can't be there at pick 54. They're not all going to be there. The guys that are going top 20 in the mock drafts, they're not going to be there at pick 54. Top 25, probably not going to be there. But I saw a lot of mock drafts from last year that had players around picks 26 to 35 that some didn't even go till round 4 of the actual NFL draft. So by no means is it set in stone because a mock drafter had that guy going pick 37, and that's too far from 54. So now let's break down these 5 draft targets that we kind of hope fall to pick 54. Starting with offensive tackle out of Arizona, Jordan Morgan. Now, you might not think that offensive tackle is a need for this team right now, and well, you'd be right. It's not a need for the 2024 Browns, but it might be a need for the 2025 Browns, and I'll explain why in a second. But first, let's get to know Morgan. He's 6'5", 311 pounds, so from a size standpoint, he checks the box. From an experience standpoint, 3-year starter for the Arizona Wildcats, making 37 career starts, all at left tackle. And I think that part is extremely important because if the Browns go offensive tackle, I think it would be with the belief of we don't see Jed Wills being there long-term for us. And I'll expand on that in just a second here. But more on Morgan. Last year, PFF graded him out at 83.5 overall. You can look at his stats, 2 sacks allowed, 4 penalties, and 11 hurries given up. But like I was saying, if the Browns go Jordan Morgan in round 2, I think it's a combination of 2 things. One, we have seen Andrew Berry always pursues the best player available method over team needs, right? Did he need Martin Emerson? No, they just drafted Greg Newsome. That was a bit of a head scratcher at the time, right? Worked out pretty well afterwards. Did they need Cedric Tillman? They just traded for Elijah Moore, but Andrew Berry likes Cedric Tillman. So the question then becomes, where do the Browns stand on Jed Wills long term? I think the national media and those in Berea are very far apart on the overall view of Jedrick Wills and the evaluation. I think those in Berea view Jed Wills as a good starting left tackle. But maybe they let him play out his fifth-year option. They did restructure his contract and add a bunch of void years to it, which is exactly what they did for Jerry Jeudy. And then they extended Jerry Jeudy. So that partially makes me think they viewed Jed Wills as a long-term option. But if they didn't expect Jordan Morgan to be available at pick 54, they may take him and then move on from Jed Wills instead of paying him a lot of money and then have a cheap left tackle for 3 seasons starting at 2025. Next guy, I'll kind of run through these ones here. KoolAid McKinney out of Alabama. He's a bit of a do-it-all DB, and I wonder if the Browns have some questions about Greg Newsome in the slot. Long term, he doesn't really seem like he's on a path to get a contract extension. I believe the Browns will pick up his fifth-year option at a little over $13 million, but maybe they decide to draft a guy that they didn't think would be there, but they could potentially need in the future if Greg Newsome is not the long-term fit at the slot position. So they get ahead of it this year. And what do I always say? Best player available. Next 2 guys here, Johnny Newton. I'm a big fan of his. I think he's going to make a really good quality starter in the NFL. I'm not sold on him being some perennial Pro Bowl player, but that's perfectly fine. You're not going to find those guys in round 2 very often. So for the Browns, if they think, hey, we want to reset at defensive tackle and not live off of 1-year free agent contracts every single year, whether it's Johnny Newton, who brings a ton of pass rushing upside, or Braden Fisk out of Florida State, these could be 2 names that we see maybe fall to the Browns at 54, and they decide, you know what, let's get some youth in that position and try and create a long-term plan at that spot and not just have to re-sign Maurice Hurst and Shelby Harrison, players at that level every single offseason to 1-year vet minimum deals when you can get Johnny Newton or Braden Fisk on a 4-year contract that'll pay you almost half of what you're going to be paying Shelby Harrison Company and other free agents over the next few off seasons. Now, before we get on out of here, if you are still watching today's video, scroll on down and drop an emoji for me. Drop whatever the most frequent emoji is on your phone or the computer, whatever you're watching on right now. It's always a fun way for me to see who watches all the way until the end of the video. Off-season mode, we're going to pick a card. I got Mr. Colin Brown with me before we go outside to watch the solar eclipse. Which card are you thinking?
Thought about it. I'm just going to go first thing that popped in my mind. I'm going to go 9 of spades.
9 of spades. You know, the solar eclipse, I like the blackout element of it, so I'll go with ace of spades. That kind of seems like, if solar eclipse had a card, I think it would be the ace of spades.
I was thinking about that the entire time. I was like, what would be a good card? You nailed it, I think.
All right, you ready? Oh, gosh. Ah, I almost dropped it all. Okay, this is making for bad podcasting. Here we go. One last one. Queen of Diamonds. Queen of Diamonds. We'll catch up later. Enjoy the rest of your Monday and go Brownies.